colleague of mine has written modules for Foreman and Catello and contributed them in 2016, so since Ansible 2.3 to Ansible Upstream or Ansible Core, whatever you want to call it. And those modules there are two modules, one is called Foreman and one is called Catello, and they handle any API interaction with either Foreman or a Catello installation, Catello being a superset of it. Being one module for managing different types of entities inside of Foreman is has been pretty hard and made using those modules not so comfortable. It was also sadly not, it was using a library that's called Nailgun, which is satellite specific. Satellite is the commercial version of Catello. And by that, the library would have releases only every satellite release, so too slow for us. And it also would only support the plugins that are in satellite. So you want support for the Salt plugin? Nope, not going to happen, because we don't need that in satellite. So we had modules, but nobody was really using them because they were not that good. Let's jump a year. No. So, sorry, I forgot a slide. So it wasn't that good. We realized that at some point. We didn't even have tests until 2018. Oops. Who needs tests? And as I said, this is deprecated. It will be removed into 12, and really, really nobody should be using that already today. We realized that rather quickly and thought, nope, let's do it differently. Let's start an own repository under our own control, and let's start anew. So fast forward to June 2017, we started a new repository. It's part of the Foreman organization on GitHub. And the goal was a central place for everybody to collaborate. Everybody at that point meant mostly Red Hat and Ethics, because we were the two companies mostly interested in having automation around Foreman and Catello. The very first step was, I've been talking about two modules before in Ansible. Let's split that out and have one module per entity that you want to touch. So, for example, if you're touching an organization, you're using the Foreman organization module, not the Foreman module anymore. We started with 6 modules to begin with. That was what was supported before in Ansible. And we also started centralizing code pretty early, because if you split into multiple modules, you first realize, but I'm copy-pasting code now. So gladly, Ansible 2.3 added configurable module utils, so you could actually drop your own stuff without being in the original Ansible repository. That was the very first improvement step, but still it wasn't enough, and it wasn't enough for getting contributors into our ecosystem. So we added tests, and we added a lot of tests, because it turned out that APIs are fragile. Ansible sometimes changes how it behaves. Python might also be a factor. So November 2017, we started adding tests, and given that we are talking to an API, the easiest test was write a playbook, execute the playbook against the live API, either it succeeds or not, right? That was the very first thing, but you cannot really run that on Travis or whatever, because you don't have a live API there. I know Ansible itself has an emulator basically for Foreman API, which you do not want to read the code of. But it's not the real thing, and it will maybe behave differently, so we didn't want to go that route. So what we did is we added VCR-based tests. If you're not familiar with VCR or Betamax, which is a different implementation of the same idea, is you have HTTP requests, you run them against a service, and you record both the request and the reply into a file. And the next time you say, do not want to run against a live service, I want to run it against my recorded version. And if you change code and the recorded both request and reply still is fine, then you know that you at least didn't change behavior. This was added in early 2018 and made us, or allowed us to have the good interactions with the API available. It still wouldn't and still doesn't fix issues when you, for example, forget a parameter or so, because it's recorded. It's not perfect, but it's working. And this was the first step to get our modules, or test our modules on multiple Python versions, because before we would only test on whatever the developer used, and now we could run it on Travis, and at the beginning it was 2.7 and 3.5. Today it's everything up to 3.8, and 3.8 stuff fails, and I have to talk to you about it. The stuff was using the Playbook CLI interface, which is an Ansible internal interface, and today it's using Ansible Runner like every good citizen should. And it took us, 1.5 years, 2019 August, which until we had actually full coverage for every single module. Thank you for that, you. And it still wasn't enough, because Ansible had this funny thing that's called check mode, and that would always fail. So we did the same thing again, but now we run our recorded tests twice. Once with Ansible playbooks directly executed, and one with --check, which you would think it's the same, but when you're talking to an API, apparently isn't. And sometimes you're forgetting like a few requests, or forgetting to do a few requests, and your check mode would just bail out because your Python code tries to read stuff that is not available. So we added that, and then at some point I realized that Ansible gained a usable implementation of an own test suite, which is called Ansible Tests, which is running on the real Ansible tree, and it can also handle out-of-tree stuff. Before 2.9, it would have to do, we did some tricks to pretend to be in tree, and since 2.9 we just pretend to be a collection, or we are a collection, so we can just use Ansible Tests on that. And we run again we run the same test that Ansible does on all of our modules and on all Pythons. So if Ansible says this is the golden standard how a module should look like, we also confirm to that. And sometimes our CI will fail, and we realize, oh, Ansible added a new test. Happens quite often, actually. Which probably is a good thing that, yeah, we're running against the developed version always, because that's where the fun is. Another thing that we added at some point is it's not strictly sufficient to test that your playbook executed, because Ansible pretends to be idempotent, at least most of the time. So you should maybe test that your modules are too. So we extended our playbooks to execute every step twice. And then we check the .change attribute of the result, and the first execution should have changed true because it should have did something, and the second always should have changed false because, well, that's how it should be. And just earlier today I was preparing something for tomorrow, and that saved my ass because I forgot to compare things properly. So this is very, very important, and I think that should be done on every module collection. Another test that we are currently implementing coming is diff mode tests, because if we are executing against an API, we usually know the state of an object before and after our call, and that's something that the user usually also is interested in because they want to see what they changed. So we return Ansible's diff output or diff data, and our tests also have entries how the data should have looked before a task executed and how the data should look afterwards. So much for tests. If you have any great ideas, yes, in the back. Because I want to see that the second will not change it. For example, yes, it can happen. Example, what I was doing earlier before, I was working on the Foreman host module, which allows you to create a host entry in Foreman, and one of the inputs is the MAC address. And I was entering the MAC address in capital letters. Foreman returns the MAC address in small letters. So even though the MAC address was the same, the representation was different, and when I would run the module a second time, it would do a change against Foreman, even though the change wasn't required because it was the same thing. And that's why it's required. Or wasn't this your question? Okay, good. No, mostly not, because no, why not? Because we not always know what the right failure mode is. If we do a request against Foreman and Foreman tells us this request is bullshit, we will forward this message to the user. This exists and this is tested, but it's not tested for every single module because we rely on the fact that our framework, which is the same for all the modules, handles it. But I'll come to that in a bit. The next chapter is documentation, because it turns out code doesn't help you if your users don't know how to use it, which is shocking. So Ansible has great facilities to have documentation, and we're using it pretty extensively. So if you ever have written modules yourself, you know the documentation stanza in the module itself, which is a pretty longish YAML usually, detailing all the parameters and explaining how to use them. And we publish build documentation on our homepage, and for everybody to see, because not everybody wants to download the modules and then run Ansible-doc on them. One of the things that I always disliked about this is the build Ansible script that is part of Ansible. It's an internal tooling of you, and you change it because you have the right and you need the need for it, but then my stuff breaks, sadly. So I'm really looking forward when we can lay off the documentation building on Galaxy or something. Perfect. Then I can delete my custom cron job that does it. And probably then I also don't have to figure out how to publish the docs myself, because today it's check out Ansible, check out the modules, run the script, copy the stuff to our the Foreman org homepage builder, and then build that homepage again. Pretty unnecessary steps and makes Git history just ugly. Another thing that Ansible introduced quite recently are documentation fragments, because given that we have many modules that are always talking to the same type of API, we have the same or similar inputs. Like every module takes a server URL and username, a password, and a validate certificates parameter. So that can be moved away into a single documentation fragment. The same applies for modules that can that handle entities that can belong to an organization. It's the same 5 lines. We do not have to copy paste anymore. We can just say uses form and dot organization documentation. It would be cool if we could have the same for return values. Good. Because we always return similarish data structure. The next, that totally doesn't render nicely. It says form an Ansible module, which is our subclass of Ansible modules. Because as I said earlier, every module shares a fair bit of identical code. Like I need to talk to an API, so I need the credential and everything. So we created this subclass of Ansible module. And first, it was just simplifying our argument spec. So removing the need to define server, admin, username, password, and everything. After that, we added error handling to it. So if any error happens, it will properly execute fail JSON for us. And given that many modules are from a workflow pretty similar, it's create, update, delete, and sometimes compare. We moved all the helpers which compares the data in the API and the data that the user inputted also into that common module, common class. And we also added, as mentioned before, diff handling. So basically, every module gets this for free, because when it requests data, that's automatically recorded after as before data, and if it changes data, it's recorded for the after entity in Ansible and just can be returned to the user again. Super helpful, and if you're managing more than 2 modules for the same API, write your own, please. It will save your ass so many times. Because especially if you're adding like a slightly different but still the same API endpoint like Catello does. Catello is a plugin to Ansible, plugin to Foreman, which extends Foreman, but also makes a few choices differently. For example, Catello needs you to have an organizations enabled. Foreman itself doesn't. So one of the differences between a Foreman Ansible module and a Catello Ansible modules is that the organization parameter is required. And given that we have like 20-ish Catello modules, it helps a lot. Yeah. Next chapter would be libraries, because that's something that I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. You do not want to write everything yourself inside of Ansible, because either somebody written a library for the API, or maybe you have to do it yourself, but still having that as a library is pretty useful. The first library we used was Nailgun, and as mentioned, it was originally developed for satellite by the QE organization, and it was limiting us, but it also allowed us to move quicker than without any library at all. So we used that because it was there. Given that it's written by the satellite QE organization, it doesn't rely on Foreman telling it how the API looks like, but it re-implements everything, because the design of Nailgun is to test satellite and test the API, so you cannot rely on the API describing itself if you want to test it. But this also meant that, for example, whenever Foreman would add a feature or change something, it would need a new Nailgun release. And with that, we at some point then thought, damn, that it's a nice library, but it's not what we aspire to or what we really want to have. So we actually wrote an own library that consumes the API. Hopla. Why does it have sound? We wrote an own library that consumes the API doc JSON, which is, it's similar to Swagger, but it's slightly different, that Foreman publishes. And this basically allows us to auto-discover parameters from the API and validations of the API and everything like that. So we still cannot completely auto-generate the Foreman module from it, because you basically get a chicken-egg problem. You first need to talk to the API to know the API, but Ansible already did the input validation or wanted to have the names of parameters. So we are duplicating the parameters in the Foreman modules, but not also in the API library. And given that we had the common Foreman Ansible module framework already, we just shifted from one library to another underneath, and it was not too painful. And I'm not looking at you. And we also had tests, so it went mostly okay. But yeah, libraries are a very, very important thing. I have too many slides for. Next is list of different extensions that we did afterwards, because we thought, we can simplify or extend something. So we used the force, basically. The first force we used is argument spec is pretty nothing, and you can define also complex nested things in it. And if you do so, instead of saying, look, the input is just a dict, don't care about the data in the dict, you can actually let Ansible do input validation and yell at the user before you talk to the API, and the API will yell at them, which saves quite a lot of time At least I think so. So that's one lesson that we learned. Define as much as possible in Ansible directly, because that the feedback is quicker, and quick feedback is always good. But we also found a few limitations for our use case in the argument spec, so we written an own spec, the entity spec, because we always, or not always, but in many cases are manipulating different objects or entities in form in itself, and the data that we would input in the argument spec is maybe 60 to 70% that we need to talk to the API already. So we extended that. We don't define an argument spec today, we define an entity spec. And the argument spec is basically automatically generated from that. And the entity spec then, it extends things like which resource type to talk to in Foreman, or is the parameter referencing list of entities that need to be looked up or something like that. Was very helpful, and it's probably also helpful if you're dealing with other entity or object related modules, not if you're just spinning up VMs probably. And then we went further and said, we already know what the user input is, and the user usually just wants to do create, update, delete. So it's the same code again. And some French guy sitting here in the room said, okay, let's make this code go away, and all the data that we need is in the entity spec. So the input that's validated by Ansible, the API endpoints that we are talking against, everything else is just module.run, done. Unless you want some specifics, or specific workflows that some modules still need, or specific validations that some modules still need, but that's still possible. It's just that in the simple modules, it's just you define the spec and you say module run and you're done. Yeah, that's the last force that we used to learn. Another thing that we used to learn or learned is you really want to have a community. The whole thing started basically as, look, I need to perform this specific task inside my team against a satellite. So the very first module that we contributed to Ansible actually only supported to create an organization, create a content view in Catalog, and publish it content view, I think, which was sufficient for our very specific workflow that we wanted to automate. It wasn't enough for ethics, and it wasn't enough for other contributors. Today we had, the numbers are from like 2 weeks ago, but I don't think that they changed a lot. 35 people who contributed. Many of them are like drive-by contributors because they're using Foreman Ansible modules and are finding a typo or a smaller fix that needs. So it seems that actually contributing is easy enough by now. And we see that we have super different types of contributors. There are, I don't want to say real developers, because everybody is in some way a real developer, but like people who are paid to develop. But there are also consultants. There are people like from operations, and there are also even direct satellite customers who use Foreman Ansible modules against the satellites, and they say, I need this feature, here's the code for it. And they're adding use cases, features, and that's pretty great. And this was one of the biggest drivers for me to continue working on this, because it was like, cool, other people are using your stuff and they're enjoying it. That's cool. Now, that wasn't that cool all the time, so initial contribution was really hard because you had to run the playbooks. We had duplicated code, we had bad tests, so la la. But then every step that I showed in the slides earlier is it allowed people to contribute more easily. And I think especially after we introduced the common framework with form an Ansible module as a class, and I think that really started off outside contributions because that allowed people to focus on their actual needs, their actual use case, instead of how the hell do I actually write a module, because they don't have to do it at all anymore. Also, having that available as a collection on Galaxy and installable as an RPM make the consumption easier, so I think that's great. And to add to that, getting away from Nailgun to a library that has less dependencies than Nailgun also helped, because before it was a bit of a nightmare to deploy. Now it's just, it's the library that we wrote and Python requests, that's it. And yeah, I think today, if somebody wants to contribute something and they actually change the behavior of a module, they have to re-record the test fixtures, and that's the hardest part, because that requires a running instance that you can basically destroy during tests. But it's getting better. And to acknowledge that I still have only five minutes left, you cannot really end a talk without having a bit of outlook. And yeah, well, what are we working like next steps? The Foreman host module is currently very sparse. Foreman allows, I don't know, probably 50-ish or 60-ish parameters when you create a host. We support maybe 10 of them. So one of the biggest goals is to support all, or at least all important, to actually being able to deploy machines. We also are thinking about having official roles to support workflows that are outside of a single module. Like, for example, I used to do the example with Catello. In Catello, you have to synchronize content from an upstream repository, Yum, Debian, whatsoever. So you need to sync, then you need to combine this content to a view, and then you have to publish that view to your client. So it's a three-step process. And we have modules for each of those steps, but you need to call them. And we could have a role that just does it for you. Documentation auto-publishing is apparently solved soon. And another thing is versioning, but I guess it will be then also automatically not. Then this is a wish list. I want to see documentation for every published release. Easier contribution, yeah, that's something that everybody wishes for. I think we did a lot, and we still can do better. And the last one is something that we cannot really influence ourselves unless we write the patches for Ansible, but Ansible has the feature of module defaults and module default groups, but that only works for a defined set of groups inside of Ansible. And it would be cool to say, look, I have this collection of Foreman modules, all of them are getting this URL and this username and this password. So we probably should talk about that. And with that, I'm saying thanks. I made it on time, I think. And if any, I have time for questions, so please raise your hands and ask me something. Or not. Then, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. That is yours.
And then again, people that are staying in, if you can move to your right.
The old problem with stage right, right.
Yeah. The other mic.
Oh! I'm not used to having two mics.
Yeah, normally it's better than here, but we're a bit limited in the facilities here at this high school.
In a way, yes, I could complain, but then again, this gets recorded for free for me, so
Actually, live stream.
even worse.
Not the beginning, but I mean, I have the recording from the beginning, but the live stream is from somewhere halfway. Okay, yeah. We're still setting up when it's like, oh, we're ready to talk. I can actually get an answer. Yeah, sure. I didn't get it before we get it together.
Oh. It should switch automatically.
Groet. Hola.
Work?
No, I'll figure something out.
We gotta stop meeting like this. How are you?